Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
When the dust settled after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were the biggest and strongest civilizations in the world, referred to as superpowers. The two countries had polarizing opinions on how economies should be run. The Soviet Union stood for communism, the United States stood for capitalism. There was bound to be some conflict. Said conflict was titled the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the peak of the Cold War. On May 7, 1962, the Soviet Union and Cuba established diplomatic relations. 20 days later, the U.S. ended their foreign aid program with Cuba.
A U-2 plane flying over Cuba for routine flight training practice photographs medium-range SS-4 ballistic missiles being assembled for installation on the island nation of Cuba. Controlled by Fidel Castro, Cuba aligned itself with the Soviet Union in its beliefs. President Kennedy is briefed on the situation. He continues on with his official schedule so as to not alarm the American public, meeting in secret with his board of advisors known as the Executive Committee, or EXCOM. The country's main concern becomes how close the missiles are to America, Cuba being just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The Soviets see this as evening the playing field after the United States placed missiles pointed at the Soviet Union and Turkey, and after the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961.
After hearing that there was missiles in Cuba, the U.S. determined that this was unacceptable and began moving military assets to bases in southeastern United States. Intelligence photos from another U-2 flight show additional missile sites. EXCOM agrees with Kennedy and begins making plans to remove the Soviet missiles without spurring a large conflict and possible nuclear war.
This is a statement from an EXCOM meeting explaining what should be done about the conflict with the Soviet Union. President Kennedy is visited by Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, who states the missiles in Cuba are purely defensive and do not pose an imminent threat to the United States. Without revealing what he knows about the existence of the missiles, Kennedy reads to Gromyko the public warning of September 4th, stating the gravest consequences would come if Soviet offensive weapons are placed in Cuba.
Kennedy briefs the cabinet and congressional leaders on the situation. President Kennedy writes to Nikita Khrushchev, Premier of the Soviet Union, "I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would in this nuclear age deliberately plunge the world into war which is crystal clear no country could win, and which would only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world, including the aggressor." Kennedy gives a speech to the American public on television about the conflict with the Soviet Union and Cuba. He explains the evidence of the missiles, his call for their removal, and the naval quarantine that was being set up.
The people in America and other countries nervously await the Soviet Union's response. Americans who believe their country is about to become a war zone stockpile food, gas, and other necessities. Schools have students practice war drills. Meanwhile, people build bomb shelters and ready their cellars and basements.
Had the jugs of water in the trunk of the car and some food and so forth, blankets and whatever. They weren't afraid necessarily, but just wanted to be prepared as prepared as possible.
Through all this fear, people still protest whether or not the American government is doing the right thing with the naval blockade.
Kennedy officially signs Proclamation 3504, authorizing the naval quarantine. While the quarantine is being put into place, the knowledge of Soviet submarines poses a big risk and throws the whole operation off.
I went down one deck where the captain's quarters were, knocked on the door, opened the door, and the captain said yes, and I said, "It's Quartermaster Brown, and I'm on duty on the deck, and the officer of the deck wanted me to tell you we have a radar contact off to the east." And he said, "Brown, go down and wake the gunnery officer and have him load one gun forward and one gun aft."
The Cuban armed forces are on their highest alert after Fidel Castro announces a combative arm. In a 90-minute televised speech, Fidel Castro announces to the Cuban public that Cuba will never disarm while the United States keeps up with their current hostility. Castro goes as far as to deny the existence of missiles in Cuba.
At an EXCOM meeting, Kennedy is notified that 2 Soviet ships are moving towards the blockade and are within miles of the blockade line. Dean Russ supposedly says to McGeorge Bundy, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." President Kennedy requests the Defense Department to draft 2 plans to increase civil defense preparations. The first outlines civil defense measures which could be taken in the vicinity of targets close to Cuba under attack with conventional weapons. The second suggests measures which could be taken in response to possible nuclear attacks within MRBM range. The American Strategic Air Command goes on DEFCON 2 on October 24th, the highest level of alert short of war.
The missiles in Cuba are now operational. Aware that Cuba and the Soviet Union are not backing down, Kennedy personally writes a letter to Premier Khrushchev. The president writes, "I urged restraint upon those in this country who were urging action in this matter at that time. And then I learned, beyond doubt, what you have not denied, namely, that all these public assurances were false and that your military people had set out recently to establish a set of missile bases in Cuba. I ask you to recognize clearly, Mr. Chairman, that it was not I who issued the first challenge in this case, and that in the light of this record, these activities in Cuba required the responses I have announced."
Khrushchev orders for American missiles in Turkey to be removed. He also demands that the United States forces not invade the island of Cuba. To this, Kennedy says that all activity in Cuba has to stop before any negotiations are made at all.
Premier Khrushchev starts to broadcast a message calling for the dismantling of the U.S. missiles in Turkey and says that in return the Soviet Union will remove their missiles in Cuba. Later in that afternoon, an American U-2 is shot down over Cuba and Major Rudolph Anderson, a pilot, is killed. After the ExComm meeting breaks up, a smaller group composed of President Kennedy, McNamara, Robert Kennedy, Bundy, Rusk, Thompson, and Zorin meet in the Oval Office. They agree that the second letter to be sent to Khrushchev should be reinforced with an oral message passed through by Ambassador Dobrin. They also agree that Dobrin should be informed that if the Soviet missiles are not withdrawn, there will be military action against Cuba. If they are, the U.S. will be willing to give a non-invasive pledge. Dean Rusk suggests one further component to the message, an assurance that while there can be no public or explicit deal over the Turkish missiles, the Jupiters will in fact be removed once the Cuban conflict is resolved. The proposal then gains the approval of the group and the president.
Ambassador Finletter is instructed to review the conflict with NATO allies. Soviet technicians have created 24 completely operational MRBM missile sites in Cuba. Nikita Khrushchev sends out a new message stating, "The Soviet government, in addition to previous issued instructions on the cessations of further work at the building sites for the weapons, has issued a new order on dismantling of the weapons, which you have described as offensive, and the creating in return to the Soviet Union." McNamara reports the Soviet ship Grozny is still stationed near Cuba. The Soviet ship pushing the blockade for 5 hours moved Kennedy to sign a deal with the Soviet Union.
It is announced by Fidel Castro that the United States needs to assure non-aggression against Cuba by doing the following things: an end to the economic blockade against Cuba, an end to all subversive activities carried out from the United States against Cuba, a halt to all attacks on Cuba carried out from the U.S. military bases on the island of Puerto Rico, a cessation of aerial and naval reconnaissance flights in Cuba airspace and waters, and the return of the Guantanamo naval base to Cuba. These would be called Castro's 5 points. At the end of the day, Khrushchev agrees to dismantle the missile sites, and the U.S. stops the blockade and secretly takes their missiles out of Turkey. The U.S. does not broadcast their Turkish missile removal, so the government will look tough and the public will feel safer.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was a tense situation that almost started World War III barely 20 years after the Second ended. It was the closest we have ever come to nuclear war. The Cold War, especially the Cuban Missile Crisis, was a time of government secrecy, tense international interactions, and public worry. After coming so close to nuclear conflict, the United States and the Soviet Union set up a series of treaties to prevent these types of things from happening. One example is the Outer Space Treaty. This is a national agreement not to send weapons into space. We also now have a hotline that allows America and the Soviet Union to communicate almost instantly, so if any issues like this should arise again, then we can talk them out without thinking the other side wants war. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a major conflict that almost ended in a war. But because of the conflict, new compromises have been put into place to prevent the United States from ever entering DEFCON 2 again.